Hi everyone. Hi. If everyone could just please take their seats when they're ready. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to invite you all to our event today. This is something that a lot of us have been working on for a while. There are a high-level panel on how driving climate action can accelerate the Sustainable Development Goals. So the organisations involved in this is Friends of the Earth, and then the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, Fossil Non-Proliferation Treaty, Christian Aid. There's two master's students working with us from the University of Galway, so Denise and Elaine, who have been absolutely brilliant. And then we have ActionAid, Trócaire and Oxfam as well. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all, and thank you so much for attending. So everyone, when you come in, will have found two brief reports just on your seats. So one of these is a summary flyer of a report that was, I suppose, an effort from a group of people, and it's called Fueling Failures. And the report itself outlines the effect that fossil fuels have on the Sustainable Development Goals, so how they're impeding progress and how they are affecting ongoing development efforts on both national and international levels. And then the second report you'll find is a report called Stop Fossil Fuels from Fueling Conflicts, and it's an outline of how the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty can be used as a tool for peace. So I suppose just to let everyone know that we do have the full reports of the fueling failures, and it's on a table over in the back corner, but I didn't want to enforce that on anyone, but you're very welcome to all take a copy of that at home as well. So I suppose just to let you know as well just about our lovely speakers and panellists today. So firstly, we will have Dr. Sinead Walsh, who's the Climate Director of the Department of Foreign Affairs with us. So huge thank you to Sinead for coming here today. And then, of course, we have Mary Robinson, who will be chairing our panel, and we have our lovely panellists here today as well. So we have Niamh Gyree, Johnny Collins, Lucas Snike. Perfect, sorry. And then we have Lillian Aspel, who will be joining us online, and Charles Ekalale from Concern Worldwide as well. Now, Charles had an emergency today, so he has pre-recorded his videos for us, and we'll be playing those as we go along. And then we will have a closing address from Beth Doherty, who is Ireland's Youth Climate Delegate as well. But yeah, I'm delighted to have you all here today, and can we all give a big round of applause to Dr. Sinead Walsh, who will be giving us her opening address.
Thanks, Dervla. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I was just trying to figure out if it's more of a climate audience or an SDG audience, and obviously it's both. But I think one of the things we're going to have to do in the context we find ourselves in today is be very clever about how we do multiple things with the same euro or dollar. Because we do find ourselves in a situation where a lot of countries are reducing or at the very least not increasing their ODA, their climate finance. And at the same time, I think everybody in this room knows that the needs are escalating so dramatically. So in that sense, I think it's quite a timely theme that you've chosen for today, because we really are just going to have to think about how to make our money go further and do multiple things at the same time. I might just give a few updates. I'm mostly sort of interested in hearing what ideas the panelists and others have on how we are clever about these two agendas, but I might just sort of give a few updates on what the government is doing this year on, I suppose, both of those agendas, in case you're not aware. I mean, I guess everybody is probably aware that Ireland has always, since 2015, taken a very strong line, has a very strong commitment to the SDGs, both in terms of what we've done internationally and also how we try to implement them in different government departments, which is, of course, how the rubber hits the road. And I think everybody will be aware that the report, the SDG progress report in 2024, is not an uplifting read, and I think it's talking about a 17% of the SDGs being on track, with only 6 years to go. So I suppose on both of those fronts, the international front and the domestic front, we're trying to see as a government, and some of you probably had a look and you probably saw that it's pretty well phrased, I think, in the programme for government, that kind of ongoing commitment, and part, I suppose, of what we want to do is look at, kind of the sort of the whole of government approach, and how do we work with kind of stakeholders, a number of whom are in this room. So we're in the middle of drafting, I don't know if we're in the middle or not, but we're drafting the next national implementation plan, which again will kind of focus on how do we really get integration in the wider set of national policies of the SDGs. We're also doing a project with Belgium and Portugal, I don't know if people would be aware of that, which is looking at kind of policy coherence across national government, across local government, in terms of sustainable development, and how do we really embed that at different levels of our government, and we would expect that sort of project to then feed into recommendations in the new national implementation plan. We have a date, I think the 11th of June, for the next National Stakeholder Forum. I'm sure some of you will be involved in that. And we have a whole series of more SDG champions. And actually, one other update that I was getting from my colleagues as I was thinking about what to say today was actually about the Tidy Towns competition, which I'd be a big fan of, because it's also where you start to see environment and climate and lots of different objectives coming together. So I didn't actually realise that the government is sponsoring a bunch of prizes in the Tidy Towns competition. So I think that's quite a good way for us to get into communities that we might not be in. So there is a bunch of stuff going on at national level, and then there's a really big challenge on how we pitch into the international level on this, and I suppose this is very much the case on the climate front as well. So I think a big event this year for all of us is the Financing for Development Conference, which is happening in Spain, the end of June and the very beginning of July. And I think for those of us working on climate finance, a big challenge is how do we pull together the follow-up that needs to happen from, the terrible acronym NCQG, the climate finance goal that was agreed in Baku with some difficulty, I think it's fair to say, in November of last year, and how do we kind of pull that together with all of the work going on, because there does tend to be a separation. There isn't actually in our government. We are the same people, the same individuals who spend ODA and who spend climate finance, and that's, I suppose, quite helpful for us to try and be coherent. But in a lot of systems, they are separate. So how do we pull those together? And as I said at the beginning, to try to make sure that every euro is doing as much as it can. The good news, there's not much good news around these days, but the good news is, and some of you know this already, we will meet our climate finance goal, which is ending in 2025, which was a really pretty significant, more than doubling, an increase of 140% in the last 3 years since Micheál Martin, the last time he was Taoiseach, announced it at COP 26. So we will meet that in 2025. We will probably exceed it a little bit, but then there will be a process, and we'll be reaching out to you guys on this as well. There will be a process of reviewing that, and how's that been going, and what the priorities are. The priorities are still very much how do we reach the poorest, how do we work with LDCs, with SIDS, with conflict affected, how do we work on adaptation and loss and damage. So we really double down on those priorities, and also things like clean cooking. How do we get clean energy to the poorest communities? But I think one sort of newer development on this is that we are coming back to that point about doing multiple things at the same time. We're doing more on biodiversity. So we're going to get involved this year in the Amazon Fund. So we're going to be giving the Amazon Fund 50 million euros over the next 3 years. And I would say that's our first very significant kind of, biodiversity intervention. We've done biodiversity here and there, and mostly in our oceans agenda, but I think that's a very serious commitment. And again, we would expect that to have climate benefits, to have SDG benefits. So that's one of the kind of, I suppose, the highlights that we're looking at this year. But really, I think as we're looking at reviewing the roadmap and looking at the way forward, it is very much that question of how do we do food and climate, how do we do education and climate, how do we do health and climate, all at the same time. And gender is going to be a huge priority for this year. Some of you will know that the Gender Action Plan is to be agreed in Belém at the next COP, and gender discussions, are difficult in a lot of multilateral fora, and we need to sort of hold the line of the principles that we all hold dear. So I think I will leave it at that, and looking forward to hearing from the panel, and particularly hearing ideas on, as I say, how we can do lots of different things with the limited resources, but at least from an Irish perspective, there is good news, but at a global level, definitely quite limited resources and quite huge challenges. So look forward to hearing ideas around that, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sinead. So I'll just welcome our panellists, so Niamh, Johnny, Lucas, and of course Mary Robinson, to join us on the stage. And we can give them all a big round of applause as well. Thank you. Just to say as well that Mary will be leaving at 3:30 just because she has lots of other engagements. So yeah, a big round of applause again, and thanks so much.
Well, I'm very happy to be chairing this distinguished panel. We're without two members physically, but they are joining us. Lidi Nakpil, who's the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development from the Philippines, will join us with audio, but join us live. And Charles Ekalele Eris, who's the senior officer of ASAL Livelihoods in Concern worldwide, can't join us at all because he's got some important alternative crisis, I think, to deal with. But he has recorded his responses, so we'll take that as it goes. But it's very nice to have the rest of you physically here with me. And I think we're talking about a very important subject because, with the climate emergency intensifying, and I call it the climate and nature emergency. I don't like to separate climate and nature. Ireland is already taking steps on climate action and the SDGs, and we have to be even more ambitious. And as a wealthy nation, Ireland has both the opportunity and the responsibility to spearhead the transition to a fossil fuel future. So by tackling the root causes of climate change and the fossil fuel extraction and dependence, Ireland can accelerate progress across multiple MDGs. But the problem is that we're not making the progress we should be making, partly because of the impact of the fossil fuel lobby. And that's going to be at the heart of some of the questions that I'll be answering. And I'll begin with you, Niamh. We know that the Sustainable Development Goals are meant to work together, and they're meant to be a roadmap for global progress, but they've been impeded by the way in which fossil fuels have operated. And so from your research, How does climate change intersect with the SDGs, and why is international cooperation critical in addressing these challenges?
So hi everyone, it's lovely to be here with you today. I am a third-year PhD in UCC in the law school, and I also lecture, and I'm also volunteer with Not Here, Not Anywhere, which is a nationwide environmental group. My research area is all about the SDGs and international law, specifically environmental law, looking at how the SDGs are, and if they are interacting with their related subfields of international law, and to see if there's kind of mutually reinforcing dynamics going on, are there tensions, are there gaps, and essentially trying to better understand this SDG international law interrelationship so that we can better design a more sustainable, more equitable, more just framework post-2030. So that's the gist of my research. Environmentally law focused is my area, so biodiversity, marine, and climate. The SDGs are quite interesting to me academically because they're non-binding frameworks, so we're not legally obliged to realize them. But if you look at the drafting sessions of the goals, you can see that they're informed and inspired by international law, also designed to be implemented in a manner that is consistent with international law. And when we're thinking about climate action, SDG 13, that of course aligns with the Paris Agreement. They were being drafted around the same time, and they were very conscious of not wanting to have any conflicts or policy tensions between the two.
There was a lot of tension at the time, and they didn't want an SDG 13 because the UNFCCC thought it had to have them. But actually it's very good, as I'm sure it'll explain, that it is in the SDGs as well.
Yeah. And it's the only SDG with an asterisk. If you look at the 2030 agenda itself, and it says, basically recognizing the UNFCCC processes as the principal forum and the leader for negotiating our global response to climate change. So we have 5 targets under SDG 13. There's no explicit mention of fossil fuels. There's none in the Paris Agreement as well. That was an intentional choice. That didn't just magically happen. We'll talk about that in a second. But when we're thinking about all the SDGs, they're all interrelated. So if you want to realize SDG 13, you have to realize all the other 16 SDGs as well. It's kind of how the framework was designed. So of course then climate change impacts SDG 13, it impacts all of the other SDGs as well. So it kind of gives us a couple of dynamics that if we take effective climate action, we will enhance the other SDGs, but at the same time, if we fail to take effective climate action, we're jeopardizing the other SDGs as well, leading to increases in poverty due to extreme weather events and displacement of people, human rights implications, biodiversity loss, health implications, implications for food security, and so on. But then at the flip side of that, other goals like addressing ocean acidification under SDG 14 or renewables under SDG 7, that all bolsters and enhances SDG 13. So there's dynamics between the SDGs themselves and then also SDGs in international law. And in the climate that we're currently living in, as I'm sure we're all so painfully aware of, the global climate crisis, which is being fueled by fossil fuels. And as countless reports and experts and scientists are telling us, we can't have any new fossil fuel infrastructure if we want to meet our international global targets, if we want to have net zero in our global energy sector by 2050, if we want to reach that critical 1.5 degrees limit on global warming. So it's simple as that. If you like it or not, new fossil fuel production is incompatible with the Paris Agreement 1.5 and by extension the SDGs. And then when we're thinking about cooperation, of course, it's essential in these spheres. These are shared challenges, very complex, universal challenges, but also we'll remember that we're all experiencing the impacts of climate change. We're not all equally impacted or in the same way. Us in Ireland, in the global north, being historically responsible for producing the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions, and then countries in the global south being disproportionately impacted whilst generating the least amount. So we have inequalities, inequities that we need to keep in mind. But we have a responsibility in Ireland, and legal responsibility to cooperate in these forums. I think we have a moral obligation as well, given our kind of position in Ireland as a wealthy country. And then obviously achieving the SDGs requires long-term, very complex changes and cooperation with other states, but with our communities, with our range of stakeholders, academia, in business, in energy, in education, and so on. It has to be this whole of society approach if we are actually to take effective action by 2030, which is when the SDGs are up, but also to realise those very critical Paris Agreement goals as well.
Thank you very much, Niamh. When you mentioned that fossil fuels weren't in the Paris Agreement, it took us until COP28 in Dubai to have the first mention of phasing out fossil fuels. It was a gentle language, transitioning from fossil fuels, but at least we got the, and then it's been lost in some other subsequent language. So we have a fight on our hands, as we know. And Dr. Collins, Johnny, I can call you. Yeah. You all look very young to me, so I'm going to call you by your first names. You deal with health aspects. And, you know, we often hear, especially in talk about developing countries, that fossil fuels are so essential to tackle poverty, or we can't really get rid of them because we need them so terribly. So what are the implications for health in your research and your organisation?
Thanks. So just to introduce myself as well, I'm Johnny Collins, I'm a UCC graduate, and I'm currently working in University Hospital Galway, and I work with Irish Doctors for the Environment. So we're a group of healthcare professionals that understand that the planetary health is linked to human health, and we can't have healthy humans without a healthy planet. So we work to advocate for that. So going back to the question, fossil fuels are absolutely a health hazard. There's an organisation, Doctors for the Environment Australia. They're kind of an organisation similar to Irish Doctors for the Environment, but they have a lot more funding and a lot more time, so they can kind of do a lot more stuff. But they published a really good report, which is up online and everyone can read it, and it's called Fossil Fuels Are a Health Hazard. And they really outline and break down the health hazards of fossil fuels. So they kind of break it down into kind of three main categories. So one is health hazards from the climate crisis itself. The second is air pollution, and the third is plastics. So under the climate crisis itself, so because there's more energy in the atmosphere, we're seeing an increase in extreme weather. So we're seeing an increase in heat waves, droughts, forest fires, and storms. We all saw recently how Storm Owen had devastating impacts. I'm living in Galway, which is quite badly hit. I was without power myself for nearly 6 or 7 days. Seeing that kind of manifest then in the hospital itself, and it's just a singular event. Like surgeries were cancelled that day, clinics, people were delayed healthcare. Like the emergency department was open, of course, but anyone seeking non-immediately life-threatening care was delayed. Then in the few days after that, because people couldn't heat their homes, the houses were growing cold, people with asthma and COPD were getting exacerbations and coming with pneumonias, people who rely on breathing devices at home to kind of support oxygenation, they didn't have electricity, so they were coming in. Then also people who were medically well for discharge but couldn't be safely discharged because their homes didn't have heat and electricity to maybe support those breathing devices, couldn't be discharged, again causing a big backlog through the hospital, and that manifests as people waiting on trolleys in the EDs. So that's quite severe. And then in more of a global sense, we're going to see changing patterns of infection. So as the temperature rises, mosquitoes are going to be surviving at higher and lower latitudes. And because we're going to see milder winters and kind of longer summers, we're going to see booming mosquito populations, and they're going to bring with them like the vector-borne diseases of like malaria, the Zika virus, dengue fever. With flooding, we're also going to see increased transmission of waterborne diseases like typhoid, hepatitis A, and a few of those. There's also going to be a mass migration. So the UN are predicting there's going to be nearly 200 million climate refugees by 2050. So those people will be coming to countries like our own country, which is less affected, but they're going to be putting pressure on our already overburdened healthcare system. So it has multiple effects. We're going to see threatening food and water supplies, which will be leading to increased conflicts and the health effects from that. Mental health impacts, such as increased anxiety and depression. And also is going to impact how we deliver healthcare. So again, like I was mentioning, how services are delayed in the hospital, but also how this impacts training and infrastructure is damaged, supply chains are damaged, and people might be able to get their medications as timely. In terms of air pollution, so the WHO estimate that 99% of the world's population live in zones that exceed their recommendations for safe air quality. There are 6.7 million premature deaths every year from air pollution alone. And the State of Air Quality report in 2021, I believe, estimated that there was nearly 8.1 million premature deaths in 2021 from air pollution alone. Air pollution increases the risk of COPD and asthma exacerbations, but also things like heart failure, or heart disease, stroke, kidney disease, and has poor pregnancy outcomes. And then in terms of plastics, fossil fuels are the main source material for plastics. And even in generating plastics, quite a lot of energy is used. And I think in 2015, it was estimated that nearly 4.5% of global greenhouse gases were made just to produce plastics alone. But plastics themselves also have innumerable health impacts. So people working at plastic manufacturing plants are at increased risk of developing cancers like leukemia, lymphoma, breast and brain cancers. Microplastics can, under 100 nanometers, can basically penetrate any organ in the human body, and this leads to endocrine disruptions. It can build insulin resistance, cause people to put on weight, and impair infertility too. And it's also associated with heart disease and stroke. So there's quite a lot of impacts really with the fossil fuels on health. So we like to say at Irish Doctors for the Environment that the climate emergency is a health emergency.
Do you think that there's enough political and media attention to the health impacts of fossil fuel?
No, I don't think so. And that's what we kind of work hard at ID to do, is to kind of increase the awareness of that, because I think when you're coming at it from a health perspective, people really can't just deny the health impacts, especially when they're so far-reaching.
Thank you. Now, my next two questions are for Liddy, and I first have to check that Liddy can hear us. I know we're not going to see her, but Liddy, can you hear us? And I hope...
Yes.
Oh, good. Excellent. We can hear you too.
Yes, thank you.
So I'm going to ask you two questions. I'll ask you the first one, and then when you've answered, I'll ask you the second one. But it's great to have you join us from the Philippines, is it? You're there?
Yes, I'm here.
I can see you. Oh, good. Oh, thank you. Well,
Yeah.
it's much nicer to see you. That's good. Okay. Well, my first question is that climate change, as we know, has been described as a threat multiplier, and meaning it exacerbates existing inequalities. And so can you speak to how gender inequalities are deepened by fossil fuel exploitation, particularly in vulnerable countries, including your own country, the Philippines?
Yes, the experiences of women in Asia really very vividly demonstrate how climate change and fossil fuels as drivers of climate change exacerbate existing gender inequalities, and of course, the additional economic and cultural burdens that women bear because they are women. No, so for instance, when we talk about impacts of climate-related disasters, there are so many, but one of the things I would like to emphasize here would be the access to clean and fresh water, that this already very little access as it is, and one of the greatest impacts of climate change, especially in many countries where they are very much reliant on glaciers for fresh water, or reliant on lakes that are now drying up because of climate change impacts. Women's traditional roles in families and communities include, for instance, fetching water for the family, fetching water for cooking and food preparations. And this kind of role is made even much more difficult. It's very much difficult already as it is. They often have to travel far away to get water from rivers or springs, and this is now made even much more difficult as rivers and springs and lakes dry up because of the impacts of climate change. And we will, for instance, also speak about food scarcity, which is being impacted by flooding and by, salt intrusion into farmlands because of the rising sea levels. This is also very much impacted by the fact that there's a lot of droughts, severe droughts that are now taking place in various parts of Asia and other parts of the South, I would say. And food scarcity has a particular impact also on women, not just women as part of families that are facing hunger, but also because one of the traditional roles and cultural burdens on women is that they're expected to feed the family first. No, you would think in this day and age, this should be no longer happening, but this is very much practiced in many communities in Asia, where the women eat last, and their first duty is to ensure that the family is fed. So this is also extremely has a more extreme impact on women when there's food scarcity and hunger. Um, our last speaker, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the name, talk about the health impacts of fossil fuel projects. And one of the things that we've also documented in many communities across many countries in Asia is health impacts of fossil fuel projects, whether they are mining, like coal mines, mining of fossil fuels, or extraction of fossil fuels like in oil fields and gas fields, or whether they are in fossil fuel production like coal-powered plants or even gas-powered plants. There's a severe impact on the local environment, and therefore impacts on health, through because of air pollution and water pollution. And women, their traditional role as carers of sick family members, that's additional stress on them, because there are many family members who regularly get sick or get diseases that are terminal diseases, like the rise of incidence of lung cancer, for instance, in communities where there's a lot of coal ash and coal pollution. And so this is another impact on women. And there are, of course, many, many stories to tell, but this is indeed one of the reasons why we also want to reiterate the message that the specific SDG goal on women is SDG 5, but if you're talking about empowering women and girls and ending inequalities, it's really impossible to do that unless you also meet the other goals in the SDGs, like addressing climate change.
Thank you very much, Liddy. You've been very clear on the impacts on fresh water, on food, also on health implications, and if people get sick, it's the woman who often has to be in the carer, and so on. Now I want to ask you about how women respond to the disproportionate impact. How are these women leading resistance efforts for land rights and for climate justice, etc.? I saw an excellent example of that again at the beginning of this month when I visited India and was with SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association. I saw the wonderful work they're doing, so I know the incredible way in which women are responding on the ground as agents of change. But tell us from your experience.
Well, I'd like to, speak about women from 3-4 countries, if I may, very, very specific groups of women. First of all, women from Bangladesh, specifically thousands of women from the fishers community from Bagerat district and Khulna district are organizing protests against the Rampal coal-based power plant there that is polluting the river Pashur, the lifeline of the Sundarbans. The Sundarbans is a vast mangrove forest area in the Ganges Delta in Bangladesh. And the struggle of the communities around in this area has been very much driven by and led by very brave women in the communities. And this is a struggle that is about struggle for gender inequality, yes, but also very much a struggle for survival, because their livelihoods and their communities are very much linked with keeping the health of the Sundarbans, the area of these mangrove forest areas. And women there understand that this is not just fighting for the rights of their families, they're also fighting for their rights and for the rights to survive and to have a much better life for their families and their communities. On the other hand, the peasant women in the Sindh province of Pakistan are very active in land rights and climate justice struggles. They're both the women in Bangladesh that I just mentioned and women in Pakistan in the Sindh province have been regular participants in our different campaigns against coal and against gas expansion in Asia, and campaigns for the shift to 100% renewable energy that is so important, because they're not just talking about impacts on local communities, of course, but because of the impacts on climate change in general. There's also women from Nepal, from our grassroots community members there, who are fighting for alternative energy sources for cooking, because in a lot of households in Asia, they're still either dependent on wood fires, but also or dependent on gas and gasoline-based, petroleum-based cooking, energy cooking. And so there's a lot of initiatives around being able to access, more solar-powered cooking energy for cooking. And they're not only demanding that their governments respond to this, they're also organizing various projects around that. And then fourth, women in the Philippines have been very active in our
Sorry,
many
what
years.
was what was that one? Sorry, I missed that one.
Women from the Philippines have
Oh, the
been very
Philippines. Sorry.
active.
Okay.
Yes. In our long-standing struggle, which we finally saw success in establishing a loss and damage fund. I think that was mentioned much earlier as an important also concern by the Irish government. The loss and damage fund was indeed something that we won after many, many years of calling out for addressing loss and damage. And the fact that it's now been established, and the Philippines is actually the host, has been chosen the host of the fund to respond to loss and damage is its official name. And now, of course, the next stage of the struggle is to ensure that this loss and damage fund functions effectively and is actually filled with funds, because now there's just a few $100 million that has been pledged, and the pledges aren't really, fast coming. So it's still another campaign to ensure that we have money for the fund.
Yeah.
So
thank you very much, Liddy. Thank you for covering quite a lot of countries in Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, and of course the Philippines, in what women are doing to counter the impacts of fossil fuel, of climate change, of climate and nature change. And it's great that we were able to see you as well as hear you. That's very good. And actually, Johnny, I'm coming back to you to probe more deeply on the fossil fuel impact, because they are very good at, this sort of advertising, greenwashing, more or less the kind of practices that we were familiar with the tobacco industry, probably even more so. So how do we counter this?
So definitely. So there is definitely a lot of greenwashing going on at the moment, and there's definitely a lot of advertising and sponsorship going on, which isn't working in our favour. And it's quite dangerous, I suppose. I was at teaching there like 2 weeks ago in the emergency department, and the audit and quality improvement team came in to chat to us. And audit's all about system design, and the audit manager, audit lead, had a kind of a very good quote from a man called William Edward Deming. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with him, but he's an American business theorist. He's a mathematician and a writer. And he's very successful in kind of helping Japan build up their economy in the post-World War II era. But his quote is, each system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. So where we're heading for this climate disaster and climate catastrophe, it's absolutely a result of like the media and the culture we're in at the moment. And it's nearly like we've no other choice. Like, we know what advertising is, we know what it does. It makes us buy things, products and services that we don't necessarily want or need. And they influence our behaviour. I'm sure many of you have also read the Climate book by Greta Thunberg, and there's an excellent chapter in that written by one of the Guardian columnists, George Monbiot, and he describes the media as the engine of persuasion that allows our earth-destroying system to persist. So I've recently come across a resource called World Without Fossil Ads. They're a company based in the Netherlands. And they help to kind of help mobilize groups like grassroots organizations like Irish Doctors for the Environment, for example, to kind of combat this and to try and fight for our voice in the media as well. And they highlight in their report, their website's really good, it's a collection of loads of research and study, and they highlight in their reports that like fossil ads, how they work is they get people's to consume more. When they do consume, they're more likely to choose the non-sustainable option as a result of fossil ads, and people also end up consuming things that they otherwise probably wouldn't have consumed without all the advertising and sponsorship. The UN call greenwashing, they say, like, delays meaningful climate action. So how do we tackle this? I think that was your question. So I think banning fossil fuel ads is absolutely essential, just as we did with the tobacco industry in 2004. And at the time, it was quite distasteful to do so, but we did it, and we saw enormous improvements in health after that as well. As part of that website, World Without Fossil Ads, there are lots of research papers on that, and one of them is saying that banning fossil fuel ads is like a necessary step we must take to create a social tipping point, and from that we can work to eliminate fossil fuels from our society. So it's quite important. But we absolutely need legislation, because at the moment no one's keeping the media in check when they're promoting and advertising fossil fuel sponsorship. And convincing people to buy products that they don't necessarily need or want. So exactly, just as we did with smoking, we need to do the same with fossil fuels now when our health is threatened.
Okay, thank you very much, Johnny. So you particularly focused on the need to ban the fossil fuel ads, but also try to stop the fossil fuel sponsorship that can also spread what is a false message, what is a message that is unhelpful, to say the least.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Now I have another of our panelists who can't unfortunately be with us, and Charles Ekalele has responded to this question. He knows the question, so I'll just read the question. Charles, oh no, he isn't alive. He's recorded, so I can't talk to him. So the question is: traditional pastoralist communities in ASAL regions have been facing major challenges due to climate change. Could you describe how these changes have impacted livelihoods? What efforts have been made to support the land and communities, and what barriers remain? So presumably we'll hear his response.
Traditional pastoral typically represents a resilient and unique system of adaptation in a dynamic process of unpredictable climate variability. Pastoral livelihoods have become increasingly vulnerable due to changes of adaptive capacities to cope and responding to mitigate shocks. Livestock are a primary source of income and nutrition for many pastoral communities in northern Kenya, and I believe the same to other parts of the world. And the pastoral livelihood system is collapsing, which has led to decline in milk availability, acute malnutrition, and critical food insecurity. There is consequent massive out-migration to the border points of Uganda, Ethiopia, and Sudan, which are better off. I believe the same happens to other parts of the world. People are moving from one area to another just to look for better areas or where climate shocks are not really felt very well. The massive loss of livestock has led to pastoral poverty and shrinking fields or pastoral rangelands due to competing activities. I understand there have been some changes that have been observed so far, which include severe and frequent drought. Many pastoralists have dropped out of traditional pastoralism, while pasture is depleting, leading them to migrate to other areas just to look for pasture. There's a big problem of water scarcity, leading to some people walking for distances of estimated 20 kilometers round trip just to look for water for both livestock and the households. Some pastoralists have abandoned traditional pastoralism and shifted to other sources of income, including charcoal burning, small businesses, and agro-pastoralism, which is also affected the same way by climate change or water scarcity. All these are leading to increased vulnerability due to ever declining economic capacity to sustain pastoralism. We are also experiencing unpredictable weather patterns, and land degradation threaten traditional herding practices, forcing communities to migrate or abandon their way of life. Concern has been working with pastoral communities to restore degraded land, improve water access, and develop sustainable livelihoods that include restoration of productive assets through cash for work, where communities are engaged to do their own activities, but with something for lunch, just to have energy to work. Provision of farm inputs, including the drought-tolerant seeds. Improving access to quality and clean water through prompt repairs and operational maintenance of broken down balls, as well as rehabilitation of high-yield water points for multiple usage to enable communities improve health and well-being. There is also capacity strengthening for both community structures like water users association and government institution, just to ensure there is proper management of water infrastructure. Concern also supports livelihoods diversification through formation of 84 village saving and loading associations groups in Turkana, and we keep on supporting and monitoring them to ensure that they have a successful way of accessing loans within their community. Concern also supports in protection of livestock through supportive treatment and vaccination to improve livestock herd immunity during these hard times. There are some barriers that still exist, which include pests and crop diseases, access to soil data information, putting in mind that most of the areas we work on are rural, pastoral, and have limited access to government support and education. Poor soil and water conservation structures is also a barrier which is still there. Not much effort has been put to this, and more is needed. Land degradation is still an expanding challenge. We have limited resources, and therefore leads to resource conflict during these difficult times. Increasing frequency of climate disasters, disease outbreaks for both human and livestock. And so far, we do not have enough expertise, so we have limited expertise in terms of human resource. We still have porous border points, which allow infection across the border communities, especially when they take their livestock for pasture and of course support the border points. We understand that these prolonged droughts have severely impacted livestock, leading to food insecurity, economic hardship, and displacement. And this has also led to increased livestock diseases, wasting in livestock due to low quality and quantity of pasture, poor economic returns on livestock, and declining livestock breeds. Policy interventions must prioritize sustainable and land management, climate adaptation strategies, and the support for affected pastoral communities. For example, here in Turkana, there is water management, livestock adaptation, climate smart agriculture, community participation, and community building strategies, which have been developed. And I believe the same have been developed in other parts of Kenya, and maybe other parts of the world too. Through system strengthening and participatory approaches, communities can draw plans and priority areas, assessing their vulnerability, strength, gaps in few of the government plans. These strategies enhance community resilience through local-led initiatives like tree planting, land reclamation, agriculture, and so on. And in terms of question 2.
We'll wait for question 2. But actually, listening to Charles, he really brings home, doesn't he, the injustice of the climate impacts on a pastoralist community that actually doesn't have any emissions, and yet they are the ones that the water dries up, everything is affected, and yet they're using traditional practices to try and fight back. It brings it all home. Just as I say, the need to focus on climate justice. We are finally coming to you, Lucas. Cities are often at the forefront of climate action and sometimes leading where national governments fall short. So what role do you see for local authorities in addressing the climate issue and in particular the fossil fuel problem?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm Lucas. I'm the global coordinator for our cities and subnational constituency, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, coming from Amsterdam, visiting you. Great to be here with those in the room and those joining us online. I think cities are experiencing firsthand the effects of intensive fossil fuel use, and it's a great threat to the health and well-being of their populations. I think we need to understand local government and city governments as the first responders to the climate emergency, and they face specific vulnerabilities and threats of the climate crisis. And so I think when we are discussing the role of local authorities in the delivery of climate action or global climate negotiations, we need to see a very specific role for them. They are also exacerbating it. 75% of global energy consumption happens in cities. They are producing 70% of carbon emissions worldwide. And this is on course to rise. Populations are urbanizing. We have this kind of 70% of the world population projected to live in cities by 2050. And I think to put this in context, we also need to think when we are talking about climate justice, the reality of urban conditions worldwide. 1.1 billion people today live in slums or slum-like urban environments. This is on course to reach 2 billion in the next 30 years. So where to start? Cities have to, of course, take a greater role in delivering local climate action. So this means decarbonizing key urban sectors that we are all very familiar with. Many of you in this room, many of those online are urban dwellers, and you understand the consequences of inaction on transportation, on energy, heating, cooling, waste management. All of these kind of ways of living in the modern city are direct consequences of petrocultures and fossil fuel lifestyles. And there are a lot of things that we can do to decarbonize those sectors. If we think about transportation, the vast majority of emissions are coming from road transportation. We know that getting people out of private cars and shifting towards multimodal systems of transportation and mobility that start with active travel, that combine active travel with public transportation, equitably distributed, affordable public transportation where people enjoy using those modes and don't feel the pressures of using those modes. And ultimately, when needed, sure, can use a car, hopefully an electric car. But this idea that we will just shift from fossil fuel based combustion to electric engines, but still think about our streets in the same way, and still think about the way that the distribution of space in our city is used is quite simply madness. We need to have a paradigm shift in the way that we move through our cities. If we think about also things like heating and cooling, 80% of energy used in EU households is to heat or cool their homes, and 75% of that is on fossil fuels, right? And so cities can take action to decarbonize those sectors, and the list of examples could go on. There's another element, though, that I'd like to touch upon, which is the role of cities in global climate discussions. Increasingly, we're seeing mayors, subnational leaders, showing leadership at the global level and really elevating the ambition of a lot of conversations, including on fossil fuels. Mayors like Yvonne Aki-Sawyer in Freetown, mayors like Anne Hidalgo in Paris, are all challenging our leaders at the national level and decision makers at the international level to do more, because of course cities are somewhat limited in their capacity to both negotiate and pressure these kind of very important global discussions. But that's something that we're really seeing. At COP28 in Dubai, for the first time, there was a local climate action summit. For the first time, cities were in the official program of the COP. This is set to happen again in Belém this year. And we really think that, due to their proximity to people, as civil society, we have the capacity to influence our local leaders that are representing us, and then urge them to call on our national leaders, to call and to take a bigger role in international spaces to ensure a fair phase out of fossil fuels and enable a just transition.
Thank you, Lucas. I've actually noticed myself in COPs the increasing role. It began with mayors appearing and speaking, as you said, but now it's actually talking about the role of cities as being part of the solution, or potentially part of the problem, but certainly part of the solution.
Absolutely.
So, do you think this will be even more visible in Belém at the?
Absolutely. I think the COP presidency of this year has already stated that they want cities and mayors to take a really important role in the official program. I think when we are looking at the need for implementation of climate action and the importance that cities can take in terms of having a pulse on what is the need and what is the local reality of a lot of their citizens or urban dwellers, that'll be really important. And we're really hopeful. We're working also with city networks like the C40 city network, like ICLE, and others. There are many. And they are an important common voice for local decision makers to then bring forward a better coordinated voice in those climate discussions. And we're really, really excited to work with mayors and groups of mayors. 130 mayors or cities and councils have endorsed a call for a fossil fuel treaty. We're working with them in a coordinated fashion so that they can bring that demand in those international spaces, and we're really excited about Belém.
Okay, thank you. Well, back to you now, Niamh, and it's a question about the debates that have occurred around fracking of gas and the LNG infrastructure. And given the risks associated with LNG, both environmental and economic, can you outline some of the reasons why the organisation Not Here, Not Anywhere are fighting against fracked gas imports?
So Not Here, Not Anywhere, I joined in 2022. So I'm doing my PhD, but have been involved with environmental activist spaces since 2018. Not Here, Not Anywhere, for anyone who's unfamiliar, we're a nationwide grassroots group. We're a volunteer group, and we campaign to end fossil fuel exploration and the development of new fossil fuel infrastructure in Ireland, strongly advocating for a just transition in Ireland and further afield. And our main area and kind of campaign objectives at the moment are related to LNG and also data centres. So LNG is liquefied natural gas. It's a fossil fuel. It's often marketed as being kind of a clean fossil fuel, which I don't think that exists at all. But there's a range of environmental, health, and social injustice associations with LNG, whether it be fracked or not. So in the Irish context, we banned fracking in 2017, 2018 in our island, our offshore Ireland, because of the environmental and health consequences that it brings, issues around contaminating soil and water, air pollution, risks of spills and leakage and fires. But at the same time, LNG, as you'll see in the media and recent discussions, it's kind of scarily coming back to the media, coming back to discussions in the Irish government. From beginning to end, LNG processes are carbon and energy intensive. Safety concerns, like I mentioned, but also health and environmental. And there's also studies from scientific experts, from policy experts, that it's nearly impossible to discern whether or not the LNG we're importing into Ireland is fracked or not. So we banned fracking in Ireland, but then at the same time are benefiting from fracking elsewhere, where these communities are suffering very severely environmentally in their local areas. Their health is being degraded because of fracking, and yet we're still importing, and it's impossible to tell whether or not the LNG we're bringing in is from fracked sources or not. So Not Here, Not Anywhere is campaigning quite strongly on LNG because of those environmental and health consequences, and also the fact that I was talking earlier of any new fossil fuel infrastructure is going to jeopardize our climate commitments, our carbon budgets, nationally, international commitments as well. New natural gas, LNG infrastructure is going to lock us into fossil fuel dependency for the next 20, 30, 40 years. I was reading some research from Professor Hannah Daly in UCC and her group, who were saying that a near complete phase out of fossil fuels is required between 2030 and 2040. And there's basically no remaining room in our carbon budget for additional fossil fuel infrastructure and investments in fossil fuel. And they also note that this, of course, has implications for natural gas infrastructure, for which decommissioning plans are required key point there being decommissioning, not new LNG terminals or not new LNG infrastructure. And I know that, of course, energy security is a big topic and it's a very important and significant conversation that we need to have. But at the same time, increasing our national reliance upon fossil fuels along LNG isn't going to give us the energy security that we need. Our energy security lies within indigenous energy sources, alongside storage and demand management and a demand reduction on our energy. There is no energy security without energy sustainability. Those two things go very much hand in hand. And we can't solve a problem made by fossil fuels with more fossil fuels. It literally doesn't make any sense. So we need to diversify our energy sources, and as we increase our renewable energy sources, we'll increase our energy security. And interestingly, if we're serious about energy security in Ireland, we need to go after our big energy consumers. And one of the most rapidly growing energy consumers in Ireland is data centers, who need to be strictly regulated. That is where energy security actions lie at the moment, as well as, of course, with renewables. But managing energy demand and regulating the energy use from our data center industries, for me, is just where the priority focus should be. Going for new fossil fuels is just completely the opposite direction where we're supposed to be heading for the well-being of us, our wildlife, our communities, our environment here in Ireland, but also the communities that will be directly or indirectly affected by new fossil fuel infrastructure by contributing to the global greenhouse gas emissions, the global climate crisis, and those vulnerable communities who we should be standing in solidarity with and trying to enhance our climate actions as fast as possible and not negatively contributing to this already growing global crisis.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Niamh. And we're back to you again, Lucas. We're seeing more and frequent severe climate-related disasters globally, from flooding in Ireland to extreme pollution in Delhi. And what do these events signal about the vulnerabilities of cities and communities? And in particular, what steps are to be taken to build resilience? And could you highlight some examples of city-led initiatives, maybe both here in Ireland and elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the vast majority of urban areas are, like I said, feeling acutely the effects of climate change. For those that follow the news, last year ended with devastating floods in Valencia, shocking images. The year began with more shocking images of fires in Los Angeles. And, if you think about large cities in the global south, these are continuous perils that urban areas are facing that are maybe not as visibilized in media, but that are present in the daily lives of inhabitants. If you think about air pollution in Delhi, for those that might have traveled to Delhi, it's tangible. It's 1 in 3 days where the air quality on WHO standards is severe or very poor. And again, when we throw around statistics like this, it can feel abstract, but this is 2 million children in a single city that are growing up with lung damage and, very, very detrimental health effects. And this is happening really worldwide. Not taking action on fossil fuels will exacerbate shocks that will be felt increasingly in our cities because of rapid population urbanization. And this is, something that should be of great concern for both decision makers locally and nationally. We are going to see increased heat waves, increased floods, those that, also across Ireland, my understanding is that in 2023 there were very, very severe floods. But this is a risk that is going to continue and increase both in its frequency and intensity. So taking action now in order to increase that resilience is key. So thinking about the ways that we plan our cities, the way that we move through our cities, and the way that we make our demands to accelerate climate action. So really use our voice from the city level and elevate that voice into international spaces of discussion is key. I was referring to this in my previous answer, but again, we have proximity to local decision makers. We can make our demands heard, and they are accountable to their electorate, to their people, and they can bring those demands in other spaces where we might not all have access to. So I really encourage kind of that grassroots advocacy to make those demands at the local level. It is a source of great social and urban innovation. Cities by just their in their essence are creative, diverse spaces in which ideas and people meet and gather, and they can really, with greater agility, often the national governments push forward some key policies. And we're starting to really see the paradigm shift about how we think of well-being in the city. And so that's something that is going to enable us to move forward. Some examples from the Superblocks initiative in Barcelona that some of you might be familiar with, of really removing space for cars, increasing biodiversity and greenery in public space. These all have a lot of positive effects beyond just increasing air pollution. They're safer spaces for women and girls to gather. They are social spaces for the elderly population. They are spaces where wildlife and kind of non-human species can return to. And so that's one example of urban planning that is really exciting, that is decarbonizing the city. But there are other initiatives, from active travel promotion to ensuring that there is no gas in new buildings. This is something that is being increasingly done across cities in Europe, but that can be done also in other areas. And then I guess lastly, I will then reiterate this innovative policy that is listening to cities and international spaces of dialogue, thinking about almost challenging the state-based order when we think of the imperative of decarbonizing our cities and leveraging the power of cities to push the agenda forward when we are faced with some blockers. I think that's really important.
Thank you very much, Lucas. Now I'm going to put the second question to Charles Ekelele, and we know he's ready to answer it because he gave us a hint. So the question is, climate change is not just an environmental crisis, it's a development crisis, fueled by fossil fuels and impacting efforts to address poverty and access to education. In Turkana, we're saying to him, you've seen how drought and resource scarcity threaten livelihoods, but also how children's education is disrupted due to these challenges. And so we ask him to speak to Concern's work in addressing poverty, SDG 1, and ensuring children can attend school, SDG 4, despite climate-related barriers. So let's hear the answer.
Concern has ensured transparent and fair processes during school bursary allocation and provision of science resources and cash to students, both boys and girls. And in Marsabit, it has facilitated teacher training on effective pedagogical approaches in literacy, numeracy, and science courses or science subjects. And we believe that all these contribute to quality education. Concern also enhances gender transformation or gender equity, eliminating gender disparities by provision of sanitary towels to girls, which has contributed to reducing absenteeism in school. There are intentional efforts which are made to ensure girls take science as subjects and even do better than boys in some areas. Both boys and girls are encouraged to take part in science fair competition, just to ensure that there is a quality education provided to both girls and boys in schools. The other supports that Concern does, which includes bursary support for vulnerable girls, provision of essential learning materials to all the needy students. There are also catch-up centers established in Marsabit for dropout girls, especially those who dropped out because of pregnancies, and facilitating access to technical skills for those who cannot join universities but prefer joining vocational technical colleges. And lastly, Concern supports in improving quality education by equipping graduates with the startup kits. Thank you so much.
It's clear that Charles is very passionate about the work that they're doing and the difficulties of trying to respond to what seems an overwhelming problem of climate change, but in particular as it affects children and their access to education and indeed to food and nutrition. So, Johnny, I'm going to come back to you with a question about air pollution, because we know that air pollution from fossil fuels is a growing concern in Ireland, with rising cases of respiratory illnesses such as asthma. And can you speak to the specific health impacts that we're seeing, particularly in vulnerable communities, and what needs to be done to address this public health issue?
Absolutely. So as I was talking about earlier, the World Health Organization have found that 99% of the world's population lives in zones that fails to meet the WHO's air quality guidelines. There's 6.7 million premature deaths each year from air pollution alone. So where does that kind of come from? When we're thinking of air pollution as well from fossil fuels, it's also from like resource extraction, processing and transport as well. But when we're looking at how this impacts health, so some of the particles, particulate matter, and we kind of break this up into particulate matter measuring under 2.5 micrometers and under 10 micrometers. We're talking about health impacts. So particulate matter under 10 micrometers has been shown to exacerbate asthma and COPD, and particulate matter under 2.5 micrometers exacerbates stroke, heart disease, kidney disease, and is associated with poor pregnancy outcomes too. So it's quite severe. So how does that data look in Ireland? So in 2022, the Environmental Protection Agency did a report, and they found that everywhere they tested air quality in Ireland, none of those were, or all of those were outside the WHO's guidelines, although they were still within the EU's legal limits of air pollution. So there's a big disparity there between what's safe for people and what's not going to exacerbate disease, and also then what's legal. Interestingly, that same year in 2022, there was a number of doctors did a study, and they looked at the air quality outside the maternity hospitals in Dublin. So they looked at air quality outside the Coombe, the National Maternity Hospital, and the Rotunda. And in all of these locations, air quality was exceeding the WHO standard. And that's particularly significant because air quality is associated with fetal growth restriction and lower birth weights as well. So that's kind of how, and in Ireland as well, this is data from the Environmental Protection Agency. They estimate that around 1,300 people a year die prematurely as a result of air pollution. So it's quite significant. So I suppose then looking at which populations are most vulnerable, so this data is from the American Lung Association, and so children are very vulnerable, so they have smaller airways. They also have a higher respiratory rate, so they breathe in and out more than adults do. And then because they're smaller, when they're breathing in and out all this pollution, it's being concentrated more in tissues as opposed to an adult might be diluted a small bit more. So people who are pregnant and their fetuses, and again I've mentioned that people who are exposed to high levels of air pollution, it can result in a higher risk of fetal growth restriction and preterm births as well. Also people with asthma and COPD are particularly vulnerable, and there's about 380,000 people with asthma in Ireland and another 380,000 people with COPD. So that's nearly 750,000 people living with asthma and COPD who are very at risk with high levels of air pollution. So air pollution in these populations sees increased exacerbations, increased medication use, and also increased hospitalizations, and also increased mortality. So it's quite significant. The other groups are people of colour. So in the past, they've been discriminated against systemically, and this is probably more prominent in America, and they're often living in zones with higher levels of pollution, so they're exposed to this air. Then people of lower socioeconomic groups, generally they're living in areas that are more polluted and they can't afford housing in areas that are less polluted, so they're more exposed. People who work outdoors too tend to be more exposed, especially in kind of urban areas where air pollution is quite high, and they're just breathing in the air a bit more. So they're perhaps the vulnerable groups. So then I suppose what can we do about it? So again, going back to that report I mentioned with Doctors for the Environment Australia, they kind of look at this in three different ways. So one, what governments can do 2, what corporations can do, and 3, what individuals to do. And because we are in an absolute climate disaster, it's important everyone does their part, and we're not waiting for one or the other, but absolutely we need all 3. So governments, they can ban fossil fuel, or they can cease investing in any future fossil fuel projects, incentivize clean energy. They need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. They need to ban advertising and sponsorship that the fossil fuel industry can use. So again, I've spoken earlier about how advertising and sponsorship uses, like persuades people to buy a service or a product, and when that product is causing a climate breakdown and harming health, that should be legislated by the government. And we've seen how that's worked so well when we've banned smoking as well. We can also talk about greener cities and have like clean airspaces. So these zones not only will have less air pollution, but like less traffic. They're safer because there's less cars driving in and out through them. We can plant more trees in city areas, and because vehicles are most of the emission in city areas too, that's the kind of whole idea behind a clean air zone. So there are ways governments can kind of tackle air pollution. I suppose corporations then, they need to lead the way and just don't wait for legislation to happen. And the Doctors for the Environment Australia have a good kind of framework mnemonic called BETTER. So it's like how people can analyse their own businesses, and it's like down to buildings, energy, trees, transport, electronics, and then or for reduce, reuse and recycle. And then on an individual level, we can educate ourselves and we can use our voice. I think that's what Greta Thunberg says is our most effective tool. And we can also insulate our homes, so we're using less electricity, switch to renewable electricity, and use active transport as much as possible. So walking and cycling, or using public transport, if not then. And it's actually interesting, there was a study done in Leeds University a few years ago, and they looked at who was exposed to more air pollution. Is it people who are out walking? Is it cyclists in the morning? Or is it people in cars? And it's actually cyclists had the least amount of, inhaled the least amount of pollution. Motorists were second, and actually people who walk suffered the most air pollution. And it's down largely to like time spent commuting. So the cyclists generally have the shortest amount of journeys. So even though they were outside and in with all the fumes, they were the best off. Next was the motorists, because obviously all the air from the car, inside the car, is coming from immediately outside it, and they're a bit longer. And then walking then, just because they generally had longer journeys, so they were breathing in more polluted air for a longer period of time. So there's a lot we can do, but we absolutely need everyone on board. We need governments, corporations, and individuals.
And I suppose you're not advocating not walking anymore.
No, absolutely not. And if everyone is walking, we're using less cars, so we're burning less fossil fuels, goes without saying. Yeah. So,
well, it's clear that our distinguished panelists have really done their homework. There's been a lot of very real information about things that we should be hearing more about, the health impacts, the need to address the problems that are caused by fossil fuel. As I mentioned, it was ironic that it took 28 COPs before fossil fuel, the words were mentioned, and there was huge resistance to that. So we are up against a huge lobbying weight. Al Gore estimates the fossil fuel lobby spends about $4 billion a year on communications alone. There is no counter to that. There's no counter in communications. In fact, our communications on climate aren't adequate at any level. There are good journalists and good people in the media who are covering, but it's not mainstreamed. It's not actually part of the health issues and the education issues, etc., that it ought to be. I think cities are very important. I'm increasingly of the view that local authorities need to play more of a role with local communities. And just to give my own personal recollection, when I was traveling around the country in 1990 seeking votes for a particular election, I also learned a lot about the country. I really did. I mean, it opened my eyes. And one of the things I learned was that the Common Agricultural Policy had brought money into rural Ireland, and that people were a bit better off, but they wanted the facilities that cities had, and they knew the government wasn't going to provide them. I mean, sports for children, facilities for the people with disabilities, for the elderly, etc. So you had volunteering with that great word, mehel, the spirit of mehel. I heard it all over the country, in every, in all communities, mehel clubs, mehel, people were volunteering together to provide what wasn't available otherwise. We actually need to have something of the same spirit now in Ireland to both counter the oppressive fossil fuel lobby that is harming us and also incentivize and make possible the doing of what we need to do. And actually governments need to incentivize more as well, but I can't say too much about governments as an Iarúcht Thrón. I have to be careful about that. But you know, it was because there was more money in rural Ireland, the people had a bit of space to do something, that it was possible. When people don't have space, when the cost of living or worries about housing or other priorities are so heavy, it's very hard to think of what we're discussing here. But we need to think about it. And I really would like you to express appreciation to this distinguished panel for their very good contribution.
Thank you so much. Mary, I know you have to head away now, so thank you so much for your time, and a big round of applause. We're going to have some questions if you want to stay up. Sorry. Perfect. Thanks so much, everyone. Brilliant. So, I guess, so just to start us off, we just will have some time now, so it's just an opportunity for everyone in the audience just to provide reflections on the panel, commentary on Ireland's support on the SDGs, and an opportunity to share opinions on key issues and, I guess, what's affecting the SDGs as well. So, we have our first question over here, so I'll just give over there, and we'll give a chance then to our panellists to answer.
Unless there's somebody less male, pale and stale, I'd like to. John Barry, Old School na Manrina, Bale Ferrishta, Queen's University Belfast and the Climate Justice Universities Union. And the point I want to make is about the role of higher education and universities in all of this. On the one hand, I want to use proximity to the Irish Dáil, where in May 2019, we declared a climate and biodiversity emergency. But, to put it frankly, WTF? What does it actually mean? Have our lives changed? And so to Sinead's point, I think, was very important in terms of how to make our investment go further. We already have a multi-million-pound institution in our higher education sector on this island. Can we not repurpose that? I mean, there is great work going on in the SDGs and climate action, but I think we're only not even touching the size of what we could do that would be fiscally neutral in terms of aligning our universities, because I think there are problems that we have fossil fuel interest in our universities. You know, another institution we're right beside here is Trinity College Dublin, which has just opened up a £3 million Ryanair centre. That's a fossil fuel adjacent industry. And so I do think that we need to be aware of how do we coordinate, and we're in an emergency. Let's really double down on what that actually means. And we cannot act in a business as usual manner. So it's the panel's views on how do we coordinate, or what do they think universities should be doing in terms of our teaching, our research, outreach and engagement, because many of the things that we're doing is actually contributing to the problem, even though there is also work in the opposite direction. But the more difficult one is, some of you may be aware of this, the Smog did an excellent piece of research on the role of big beef and dairy in Irish industry, because in Ireland there's not really fossil fuels that are a major source of greenhouse gases, it's methane because of our agri-food and land use system. So how do we divest from fossil fuels? And sadly, many of our universities are invested. So there's a divestment of removing fossil fuel interest from universities. But then on the positive side, how does government, and it really does fall to government, given that it funds most universities, to coordinate to respond to an emergency? Because my fear is that we're still treating the climate and ecological crisis as a kind of a normal policy issue. You know, some of us are really concerned, not just with the health impacts in terms of the millions that die around the world unnecessarily because of fossil fuels, but if you want to really scare yourself and the weather outside and put you in mind of this, look up the AMOC, the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. It's what keeps Ireland and Britain, you know, rather temperate. It's showing signs of weakening. So we are in an emergency, it's getting worse, yet my fear is that we in the university that should be having a public duty to our citizens. We're paid out of public tax, and this would be fiscally neutral in my view. It's not any extra money. We should be being asked by government to do an awful lot more work in connecting with our communities. What about research and finding ways? Can we find non-fuel ways of using coal, oil and gas? Where's the research in finding, ways to use those resources? So your questions are both removing fossil fuel interests and locking us into a carbon future, which I fear a lot of what we do in the university system, that's where it's bringing us. But more, what do you think is the role of higher education in the context of this existential crisis that we face?
Complex question. This is something we've talked about before, about kind of navigating activism and kind of academia. And it's interesting that from my background I came to environmental law through activism, and that definitely shapes my view and understanding of environmental law. I'm always very upfront about that. In panels and also in my teaching, I lecture 2 modules in UCC, and at the beginning of each module, I'll say, this is kind of my background, science, environmental activism, law. I have my own opinions, and as we all do, you don't have to agree with me, but I am going to share them with you, and we can have discussions about that. And I bring my learnings from these activist spaces into my classes. And there's a lot of appetite. I can only speak from the environmental law perspective from teaching that. But there is appetite among students to engage with these often very contentious issues. My research is always coming back to traditional economic growth and how that clashes with environmental conservation. And I bring that up all the time. I'm sure they're sick of me bringing that up. But they're always very open, and we have these very complex and interesting discussions around navigating these very interesting but complex issues. So I think there is an appetite from students to engage with those issues. I think there's pockets of very passionate lecturers, researchers, students. I know UCC divested from fossil fuels a couple of years ago. I can't remember what year. I assume that was student-led.
I think so, but I'm not sure if they've fully done it.
But I suppose we've seen a lot of change in UCC from student-led movements. So there's a lot of power there. I know we were talking about with Mary about kind of engaging with local authorities, and I think it's important to remember that we have more power than we think in terms of influencing institutional policy or local authority policy. I mean, Dervla and I drafted the motion for Cork City Council to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and then that was passed by the council. And we were both students at the time, so you can impact policymaking in institutional, local levels in more ways than you may think. I know we have national education for sustainable development policies. I've seen kind of incremental changes, which obviously is important but frustrating because it needs to be this holistic whole of every single discipline coming together. I wish I had an answer of how to kind of, this role of higher education, I think it's to inspire, to have these critical discussions and these hard discussions, having this critical analysis, but also curiosity. Just because I'm very critical of the SDGs, as we all should be, but it doesn't mean that we're tearing them apart and not using them anymore. It's to be critical, seeing what's working, what's not, where the gaps and tensions are, and then how can we do this better? So it's kind of cultivating that critical thought, but curiosity hand in hand. And I think it's just about being honest and having these environmentally focused discussions across all of our disciplines as much as we can, and going from there.
Perfect, thank you so much. Does anyone else want to add anything, or we take another question? Oh, yeah.
Well, just really quickly, I think university campus is a great kind of pilot to then go into city level campaigning, and I think we can infuse the urgency of the climate crisis more in university spaces and push for things like divestment that can then galvanize a student population to feel like they have a voice politically that can then extend to subnational and maybe ultimately national level. And so I think that's a really important way to think of the university. And this past year, we've seen also a lot of galvanization on university campuses worldwide, and I think we can maybe build on that energy and bring that energy also to the need to phase out fossil fuels.
Perfect. So we'll take another question there. I see another hand up.
Hi, thank you for that. Shauna Cord, journalist. My question's really about, so Dr. Walsh said at the beginning, we have 6 years to go to meet the social development goals. Only 17% of that has been delivered so far. And obviously, the last 5 years have been with a government with a big green element who were pushing that agenda. Whether they got what they wanted is another thing, but we've seen from recent storms, Eowyn, we saw like a massive sort of discourse online about people being left without electricity for days, and, you know, the usual disinformation with everybody jumping on going, well, we can't move away from gas to electricity or coal fires to electricity because it plugs that gap. So we have that problem in the middle of all of this, but with a government that includes some TDs who, you know, on their own social media go into the office and sniff turf by their own admission. I mean, my question really to the panel is, do you have any faith in this government to deliver what's needed in those next 5 years, considering, you know, the next 5 years are really vital in this fight? To everybody, please.
Great, yeah, really good question, and hard to answer as well, I suppose. I suppose I've faith in people. I faith in like activist groups, in climate groups. Even on the HSE, I see like funding is coming in more than it would have been, and like there's good opportunities coming up even within the HSE for helping to decarbonise things. So I think things are really moving in the right direction. It's just the question everyone is asking, like, will they be moving in the direction fast enough, and will we get there on time? But I do think if we hold them accountable, and if the grassroots keep doing their thing and the media keeps supporting us, I think we can get there, because I think the politicians in this country, fortunately, they're honest. I think they do have the public in their heart as well. So I think that if we demand it from them, and if we have support from the media, and if we can educate people to demand what we need, I think we can get there. I don't know, is that incredibly naive, but that's what I believe anyway.
I'd agree with Johnny in having faith in the grassroots movements and in the environmental people on the ground in the local communities. I think it is right, it's about 70% of the SDGs are on track to be met. Most of them are kind of indicating moderate or stagnating progress. Some of them are regressing to kind of 2015 or pre-2015 levels. Because of a lot of factors, inadequate financing, obviously COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, the war in Palestine are all contributing to this inadequate progress. I would put my faith in the environmental movements, in kind of these connections that we make in these circles. It's a good question, and I don't want to be cynical either. I guess but I think left to their own devices, I'm not sure we would meet there, but I think it's groups like Not Here, Not Anywhere, or the groups in this room that have to continue putting pressure, because I don't know where we'll end up otherwise.
Thank you so much, Niamh. So we'll take another question if anyone has any that they'd like to share. Perfect.
Hi folks, so my name is Ali Sheridan, and I work with an initiative called the UN Race to Zero initiative, but I'm also chair of the recently established Just Transition Commission of Ireland, and indeed had the privilege of working with some of the Fossil Fuel Treaty team in the past as well, so it's great to see folks together here today. I have two questions, if you'll oblige me quickly. And the first is on just transition, and certainly it emerged through the conversation and some great takes from the panellists. But I really do have a sense that while just transition is, of course, not new as a concept, it's definitely emerging. And I really have a sense that the norms of just transition are being set in the next few years. So the definitions, the operation of just transition, and in terms of how we lean into it. But there is also a risk that the version of just transition we land on limits it to addressing the impacts of negative behaviours, and somewhat assumes that the systems, the sectors, societal approach, we remain on a business as usual approach. So really my question there is whether we can ever have a just transition with fossil fuel expansion. And then my second question is just to bring us back to Ireland, and we got some great insights from Niamh in particular around some emerging developments around fossil fuels in Ireland, and certainly some challenging areas, data centres and others, in terms of energy demand. But Ireland, on the global scale of things, isn't a huge fossil fuel producer. So when it comes to international just transition, when it comes to fossil fuels, what is the role for Ireland in something like a fossil fuel treaty or in the internal negotiations? Like, what is the value of our participation and what is our responsibility in those spaces as well? Thanks.
Thank you, Ali. And yeah, it's a really important question. I think on the emergence of definitions on just transition, you're absolutely right. And I actually, have the privilege of working in an extremely international working environment with a lot of partners that are global. And we are, actively in conversations also with colleagues situated in the Global South to be at the forefront of those definitions. And I think those that bear the greatest responsibility in the climate crisis need to also uplift and lean on the voices that have been disproportionately affected and often marginalized from decision-making spaces. That being said, there is a role for countries like Ireland, countries in the north, to bear that responsibility. And the Irish government has shown leadership against fossil fuels from the anti-fracking bills that have been mentioned. They are membership of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. They have played an outsized role in international negotiations in the past on nuclear non-proliferation. And so we think it's a really important role to play. And governments need to demonstrate ambition and faith in multilateralism at a time of great difficulty. And it is an important role for them to play. We're seeing questions being discussed, and even at the local level in Ireland, 6 local councils have endorsed, and this is really exciting. Also at the university level, there's a vast kind of tissue from civil society that has been working on this, and a fair phase out of fossil fuels is intrinsically connected to a just transition, and so we absolutely cannot kind of throw around this term at the risk that it becomes eternally diluted without addressing the root cause of the climate crisis, which is oil, gas, and coal. And so if we think about the fact that 86% of all carbon emissions come from fossil fuels in the last decade, and yet governments are on track to produce more than double what is consistent with 1.5, we're simply not engaging in a serious conversation. We need to ensure that those that have disproportionately created the conditions in which we are in now take a leading role on financing, on elevating and supporting those. And within a fossil fuel treaty framework, just transition is a core pillar of our initiative. We don't simply call for the taps to be turned off immediately. Some countries will need to be the first to phase out and to stop their extraction, while others will need to continue using coal, oil, gas in some cases, and receive the financing and the technical capacity to transition. So there will be a wide range of initiatives that will have to be taken, but the first to transition need to be the wealthy nations in the north. And if you look at the countries that are, benefiting from continued extraction, they are largely situated in the north. The U.S., the U.K., Canada, Australia, and so in a framework of just transitions, we need to move away from that as soon as possible to allow others to transition towards more to a more diverse set of clean energy.
Thanks for the question as well. But I completely agree. There's already enough. We already have enough access to fossil fuels to blast through the 1.5 degree rise in temperatures. I think we already broke it there. Was it in January or December? So it's quite alarming, and it's probably quite sooner than we all thought. And then I think to answer your second question, Ireland probably isn't a big producer, but we're probably a big consumer. So we probably get our fossil fuels from other countries, and we probably consume a lot. I think Irish people have quite a high carbon footprint, and we're quite a wealthy nation, as Mary Robinson was saying. We do have a lot of power in that regard, and we absolutely have to be like a shining example of what a country can do, especially with uncertainties in the US at the moment too. So.
Yeah, essentially echoing what has been said. I think Ireland has a duty to advocate very strongly for a just transition and a reduction in fossil fuel production. I think standing in solidarity with those most impacted and endorsing the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty would be a very interesting and impactful way to do that. I don't know if any EU country has done that as of yet, so we could be the first. Showing very strong ambition and leadership there, so loudly and explicitly committing to reducing fossil fuel use and production, and also aligning with that program for government commitment to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. So I think we have a moral obligation, a legal obligation, I think, loud and proud against fossil fuels as much as possible.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We have time for one more, so take it from Killian over there.
Thanks so much. I'm Killian from ActionAid. I think Liddy is not online anymore, but just to say one of the questions, climate finance was mentioned at the start, but I wanted to ask Liddy what Ireland can do in terms of debt, because countries generally are restructuring their debt, pay about twice as much to restructure their debt as climate finance. So what role can Ireland do as a political choice, not just a financial one? But just coming back to that point around our focus on economic growth versus our climate commitments. The programme for government was mentioned earlier, and there is some good language on climate finance, but the majority of it is about growth, growth, growth. And it's this question of, does our economic system fit for our climate commitments? ActionAid brought out research in 2023 showing that Ireland is used as kind of a conduit for flows going to fossil fuel industry. So there is a fossil fuel industry in a sense that it's coming through Ireland to these systems, or to these fossil fuel companies. So my question is, does our current economic system really fit the bill for where we're trying to go with? So yeah, thanks.
It's quite a loaded question. I would say that definitely, speaking also from a global context here, we will need, and connected to, I think, Ali's question about just transitions, we will need to be very critical of the economic systems that guide our current practices, especially when we are thinking about just transitions. So I'll just give you that perspective. If you think about the extraction of minerals for renewable energy, for example, we will need to be thinking very differently about how we operate. And currently, this focus on growth or green growth definitely has its limitations and will hit hard walls. We know that there are many practices that are possible within a more energy diverse future that is rooted in the well-being of populations, and there's a lot of good research and technical knowledge that is being elevated in these spaces. And so definitely at a global level we need to be very careful about business as usual, but just from a electrification perspective, or business as usual from a renewable energy perspective, and make sure that we are advancing with the widest set of possibilities that are grounded in equity, justice, and the well-being of all populations in an energy equitable future.
Do our economic systems clash with environmental commitments? Yes. That's the common thread within my research. I'm looking at environmental law, international environmental law, and the SDGs, and it's what I keep coming back to, which I didn't really expect before starting the project. The system we're currently working under is kind of that business as usual approach, inequitable, unsustainable. There's huge clashes between traditional economic growth and conservation, and lots of time in international law we're continuing this business as usual approach. You'll see it in biodiversity law and marine law, in maximum sustainable yield in terms of fish stocks, in terms of we're managing our biodiversity and our environment to extract as much as possible, trying to still then maintain ecological balance, but it's that economic thread is so strong in sustainable development. It always has been since it was kind of formulated in Brundtland, in the Brundtland report in the 80s. Lots of literature on kind of degrowth and post-growth, and it's very interesting. It's not my area, but I kind of keep an eye on developments. I found it quite interesting and inspiring. But say if you're even thinking about GDP, gross domestic product, that's how we're measuring progress, but there's lots of literature on the limitations of that in terms of assessing human well-being and welfare. And Jason Hickel does a lot of great work on this. He has a book, Less is More, would recommend it. It's very accessible. But basically, he writes that globally, GDP has to increase by about 2 to 3% each year, which sounds small, but it's exponential growth. And currently, our systems, traditional economic growth and resource use, material use are tied together. So as we grow, we're using more resources and more materials. If we infinitely grow, with finite resources, land, biodiversity, limited ecological barriers and boundaries, it doesn't make sense. We can't have sustainable growth that is sustained. And it's interesting that you see this contradiction in international law. It's in the SDGs as well. I think, is it SDG 8 or something like that, that is going for sustained and sustainable economic growth? Can sustained economic growth be sustainable? Sustainable development is really a contentious issue. Lots of people don't think sustainable development is actually sustainable at all. So it's a lot to navigate, but I would say no, there needs to be such an incredibly radical in kind of the best way shift in terms of our economic systems that values our people and our planet more than profit and the pursuit of profit and power.
Thank you so much. We're going to hear from Beth Doherty now. So Beth is Ireland's Youth Climate Delegate from 2024 to 2025. So she's going to give us our closing address. But thanks so much to our wonderful panellists.
Thanks so much, Dervla, for the panel and for the introduction, and also just the amazing panelists. It was so interesting to hear, and for the keynote earlier as well. Just following on from those, I guess I'd like to reflect on a few key takeaways from the day and where we can go from here. And I guess most critically, I'd really like to emphasize the need for us to reject the fossil fuel era, which has been a pretty consistent theme, I would say, to understand the possibilities that we have, and I guess to be brave enough to reimagine now how we go forward as a country, uniquely positioned to take leadership in this transition. I first got involved with climate advocacy 6 years ago when I was 15, originally with school strikes here in Dublin. And since then, I've been involved in a few different things. And as Dervla said, I'm currently serving as Ireland's Climate Youth Delegate. And as part of this role, last summer, myself and my predecessor met with a lot of young people from around the country, from a lot of different organisations, a lot of different communities, areas, really to get their perspective on what they wanted from COP29. And some of the really key themes that came out of that and came out of those young people have also arisen today. And so primarily, the really key message we got was that they want clean development. You know, they want their homes, their communities, and their country powered by energy that doesn't destroy the environment and human rights. They want leadership which is brave enough to reject the fossil fuel-based systems we developed 200 years ago, and which instead moves towards prioritizing sustainability and imagining what our world looks like when we move away from these fossil fuels. And they want that just transition that we talked about, moving away from fossil fuels in a way that supports people to have good jobs, supports the most vulnerable, and I think crucially puts people and long-term sustainability over short-term profits for a small number of companies. In essence, they wanted an equitable fossil fuel phase-out. And a lot of young people were also very concerned by the role of fossil fuel companies in driving climate policy at the moment and in these negotiations, which was also mentioned by former President Mary Robinson on the panel. And throughout these experiences with young people, and then especially on the ground at COP28 and COP29, I've been struck by how long fossil fuels, the dominant cause of the climate crisis that we're all aware of, have remained the elephant in the room. As we heard on the panel, none of our 3 key international agreements on the climate crisis even mentioned them, and it took us 28 COPs to even name the cause of the crisis we're working to tackle, while fossil fuel companies continue to lobby these negotiations and their outcomes. And while fossil fuels and the companies that run the industry keep themselves out of the spotlight of climate action, they have continued to pollute our communities, to violate human rights, and to destroy our chance of maintaining a livable climate. Despite the scientific consensus that we're all aware of that we can't continue to proliferate new fossil fuels, we still lack a commitment to, at a minimum, no new fossil fuel expansion going forward. Even if we stopped issuing new licenses globally today, we would have enough oil, coal, and gas to keep powering us until 2050. So every single new license that we grant is an acceptance of continuing the climate crisis and a vote in favour of violations of human rights and regression on the SDGs, especially in the global north. So why have we struggled to take the necessary bold action in ending the fossil fuel era, despite this scientific urgency? This is a story of denial, of greenwashing, of making us believe we are dependent on fossil fuels, of focusing on the actions of individuals rather than the wider structures around us, and undermining the voices of the public and those affected by the climate crisis. It started with denial, and I think this helps us understand a lot of the things we've discussed today. It starts with denial going way back to the 1970s, when the American Petroleum Institute created a task force to monitor developments on climate change, and an internal assessment by ExxonMobil that some of you may be familiar with predicted catastrophic effects unless we left, back then, 80% of the fossil fuels that were available were left underground. Despite this knowledge, the API proceeded to suggest that continued fossil fuel exploration would be safe and actually beneficial for us all. And at the same time, they shifted the responsibility and the focus away from their activities towards individuals, with BP inventing the term personal carbon footprint and spending millions advertising it. As people became more aware of the realities of the climate crisis, they shifted to what's called necessitarianism, which is where they convince us that we cannot live without their product, without fossil fuels, when the reality is we can't continue to live with it if we want clean air, healthy communities, good jobs, and all of the other promises of the SDGs. And again, as touched on during the panel, lobbying has persisted throughout all of these phases. At COP28, there was 2,500 lobbyists, and at COP29, which was itself a smaller COP, there were 1,700. To put that in perspective, they outnumbered the top 10 most vulnerable climate nations combined. And I think if you put together the presence of the fossil fuel industry with those going underwater because of the emissions from these companies, what does that say about the priorities of these negotiations at the moment? Fundamentally, right now, the bottom line of the fossil fuel companies inherently conflict with the goals and commitments of those striving for meaningful systemic climate action and the kind of future that we've discussed today. And yet they continue to get more representatives than those being affected by this crisis. Their interests of the fossil fuel companies inherently conflict with the promises of the SDGs, and our continuing reliance on fossil fuels undermines our ability to reach these goals together. The effects on climate action, life on land, and life on water are well documented, and the panel did a fantastic job of outlining the different effects on various SDGs, whether that's health, with rising asthma, especially in children, in the water we drink. You know, as Johnny mentioned, I think it was a great way of phrasing it, the fossil fuels are a health hazard, and this is a health emergency. We are being asked to pay for the profits of companies with our health and with our lives so that they can make more money until we run out of these fossil fuels. For gender equality, you know, Liddy outlined how fossil fuels exacerbate gender inequalities, the specific vulnerabilities of women in particular to the effects of the climate crisis. And I think particularly as well drawing attention to the links of the fossil fuel industry with SDG 16 for conflict and peace, and how fossil fuels, which the world continues to subsidize at $11 million a minute, fuel destruction of our planet, peace, and human rights. Fossil fuels worldwide power war, they power genocide, and they power crimes against humanity. And not just they don't just power this, they actively profit from war and from the destruction of human rights. In the words of Ali Rosenbluth, the fossil fuel industry is not just destroying our climate, it is actively profiting from genocide. To me, this really shows the interconnected nature of the climate crisis and how the climate crisis touches absolutely every issue, which Niamh outlined, and how every single SDG is dependent on us tackling the climate crisis, and we can't look at any of this in isolation from itself. I realise this is a really bleak picture, but it's not a guaranteed one. We're at a juncture now with the power and the ability to change this story and to change the course of development that we were put on with fossil fuels 200 years ago. Ireland is in a unique position to lead on ending the fossil fuel era, to move away from fossil fuel dependency, and to step us up to lead transition. Ireland has already taken leadership in many ways, including banning new licenses for fossil fuel exploration and internationally through the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. But we now have the chance to go even further and to create an international commitment to halting any new fossil fuel infrastructure and giving ourselves the chance to develop cleanly and with respect for human rights while still achieving the SDGs. Ireland has a proud and strong record of and commitment to overseas aid. It has always striven to show solidarity with the small island developing states who are facing the brunt of continued global dependency on fossil fuels. We now have the chance to join with small island states and to lead on this energy transition globally, to put the survival of the most affected people over the profits of these companies. This is also an opportunity to work globally for more, stronger, and fairer climate finance that meets the global climate finance need and doesn't continue cycles of debt that are currently happening. Especially given Ireland's strong record in overseas aid and support, this is a place where I think we can really lead. The benefits of renewables, especially compared to destructive fossil fuels, are well documented and outlined, especially by the panel. Jobs for rural communities, improving energy security by not continuing to rely on imported oil and gas, lower energy costs for ordinary people, and improved health for us all. And this can come from the national level, but also, as Lucas outlined, really harnessing the power of cities here in Ireland to lead on this change and get the benefits for the populations of these cities, whether that's Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Galway, all over the country. We know that the energy transition needs to happen locally, nationally, and globally, and it needs to happen now. We can't afford to continue to delay or to believe the messages that have been sent out by the fossil fuel industry any longer. As a country with strong links to humanitarian work and a proud record of global solidarity, we now have the opportunity to treat the climate crisis as the humanitarian crisis that it is, and to call for the strong systemic change we need to end the fossil fuel era. Therefore, as we go forward, I think we need to be bold enough to reimagine our world. Until now, fossil fuel interests have relied on us believing that there's no other way, but we know that there is, and that Ireland can be the one to lead that. We need bold action, locally and nationally, to build cleaner communities, to end the fossil fuel era, and to support those who need it most to build a collective, healthy future, rather than to build profits. And I think with this, we can rewrite the story about how we're developing, and we can change course away from fossil fuels towards a path based in science, human rights, and a livable future for us. Now is the time, and I think Ireland is the country to lead with the ability to lead this charge for this if we take this opportunity while we still can. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Beth, for that incredible and moving speech. So I just wanted to invite you all to stay just for the next hour or so. We're going to have some refreshments, some tea, coffee, biscuits, which will be served down the back. But thank you so much all for coming today. And a huge, I suppose, another round of applause for amazing panelist speakers for their time today and for their, I suppose, expertise. So.